Greetings everybody. GleeCon, here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we kind of saw Malygos with his, mentally being... He's got this little Calic ghost from the future on his shoulder, in his mind, watching everything he does in this prehistoric past. We saw Malygos kind of investigating Galakron's lair and trying to figure out what's going on. He sees that some dragons are surviving, some of the ones that Galakron eats, but most of them, and he sees it happen, are barfed back up by Galakron and resurrected as undead dragons. And there's something fishy going on with this Koros rival of Malygos. He's either being stupid or he is perhaps even acting in consort with either Galakron or the forces behind Galakron. So let's stay a while and listen to Chapter 3 of Dawn of the Aspects, Chapter 3 of the second part, called Hunted by the Undead. Malygos retreated, the icy blue proto-dragon already flapping his wings for flight. Unfortunately, he failed to see one of the undead creatures rising to his right. Its hiss was his only warning. A foul mist exhaled by the undead touched his wing. Malygos roared as he felt a coldness that even he could not stand burn deep into his body. Despite his agony, Malygos exhaled in turn. Frost covered the attacking creature, but whereas it would have stiffened many an adversary, it only slowed the undead. Still, that gave Calic's host just enough time to leap into the air. Ignoring the pain, he pushed higher and higher. The chorus of nerve-wracking hisses below gave warning that several of the undead were giving swift pursuit. Despite Calic wishing desperately that the proto-dragon would look down to see how close they were, Malygos kept focused on his ascent. He flew on, seeking the clouds above. Calic finally understood that his host hoped to evade the winged horrors by losing them in the murkiness of the clouds. Malygos did not breathe easier even upon attaining cover. He veered sharply to his left, then after a short distance flew level. Behind him the hisses of the undead spread throughout the clouds. Some sounded farther and farther away, but others still hinted at pursuers yet on his trail. Malygos kept his jaws clamped tight, breathing through his nostrils as best he could. Any sound, even an exhalation, might prove enough to catch the attention of the undead. Calic, forced to accept whatever decision his host made, remained impressed with the proto-dragon's intelligence. Despite everything, this Malygos was very much the Malygos who had ruled so wisely for so long. This was the Malygos whom a young Calic and every other blue dragon had looked up to in admiration. And yet he is still a proto-dragon, Calic reminded himself. How can this be? How can... Another hiss arose from in front of Malygos. The pale red corpse collided with Calic's host. The stench of decay poured over Malygos as the undead proto-dragon hissed in his face. Up close, bits of the skull could be seen through the areas where shreds of dry flesh had fallen away. One eye had sunken in. Teeth dripping with a thick mucus snapped at Malygos' throat. Claws tore at Calic's host, ripping through scale. Malygos lunged, seizing the undead's lower jaw in his teeth. With one powerful bite, the proto-dragon ripped the jaw loose. A thick black fluid that had once been blood spilled out of the ragged wound. The creature did not falter, but loss of the jaw prevented one source of danger to Malygos. Calic's host spit out the rotting piece, then quickly exhaled into the exposed throat. The icy mist poured into the undead, freezing the insides. Malygos' foe contorted. It released its hold on him. Malygos whipped his tail forward, striking the frozen torso. The undead shattered, the top half and bottom halves falling in separate directions. The winged upper half remained aloft for a moment, then even the pretense of life faded, and the remains dropped out of view below. That's actually pretty cool. But from much too nearby came more hisses, indications that several of the other undead had been drawn by the commotion. The state of decaying flesh still on his tongue, Malygos pushed forward. So this is basically now like a zombie movie, but with dragons. That's actually a pretty cool concept. Another of the animated corpses materialized from the murky clouds blocking his path. Malygos attempted to arc past it, only to have a second come for him from that direction. Calic's host immediately stopped flapping. He dropped like a stone, falling beneath the two undead. But as he broke through the bottom of the cloud cover, Malygos discovered that he had escaped 2 to fall into the midst of 4. The empty, hungering faces surrounded him for the first time, causing Malygos to lose hope. "No, do something," Calic silently roared to no avail. "Do something!" Two of the unliving monsters lunged at Malagos, who managed to evade only one. The second seized his left forearm and wings, snaring Malagos thoroughly. The other three fell upon him. Malagos exhaled on the one holding him. Again, the ice only slowed, not stilled, the undead, and even though none of the four moved with the smooth swiftness of the living proto-dragon, they had him caught. Kalik felt the certainty of death, or worse, creep into Malagos' thoughts, even as the proto-dragon continued to struggle. Then a hard blast of what seemed like sand caught the foremost fiend in the back. The sand struck with such intensity that the shriveled dry body cracked in two. The undead proto-dragon twitched wildly as it still sought to keep hold of Malagos. There came a ferocious roar from another direction, one so thundering that at first, Kalik and his host both thought that Galakron had come upon the scene, but the roar was followed by Neltharion's familiar laugh as he ripped into the side of one of the other clinging corpses. The next nearest corpse turned back to Neltharion, but again a blast of sand shot forth, battering the undead so hard that the creature was sent tumbling away. The blast was followed by a brown form that caught the whirling corpse at the throat and bit through the bone and scale with such force that he neatly severed the head from the torso. The body fluttered around aimlessly, heading off in one direction as the newcomer spat out the remnants with as much obvious distaste as Malagos had earlier displayed. With only the fiend with the broken back and one other foe, Kalik's host was better able to defend himself. He grabbed the grasping hindpaw of the ruined creature and thrust it at the second undead proto-dragon. The paw instinctively seized the wing of Malagos' other attacker, giving the icy blue male an opening as his foremost opponent struggled to pull free. This time Malagos breathed upon the wings of his broken attacker, exhaling until he had no breath left whatsoever. Vertigo almost overtook Kalik's host, but the proto-dragon fought to stay conscious. Frozen stiff and heavily laden with ice, the wings pulled the one undead down. The second creature, still clutched by the first, also dropped, unfortunately in the process taking Malagos along with both. As the three of them fell, Malagos bit at the arm of the second fiend, fighting through the bone as quickly as he could. Past the hissing countenance of the one undead, the proto-dragon and Kalik saw the ground rushing up. The bone finally cracked, as did one of Malagos' teeth. The pain was a momentary annoyance compared with what would happen if he did not finish biting through the limb. Kalik's host clamped down, and the last of the bone gave way. Beating hard, Malagos kicked at his foremost foe as he pushed skyward. With a horrendous ripping sound, the last muscles and tendons separated, enabling him to escape the two undead. The animated corpses crashed into the rocky landscape, the collision so intense that both dry forms shattered, sending bits scattering in several directions. By that time, Malagos, the remaining paw finally removed from him and tossed aside, was well into the sky again. And there, Malagos beheld not only Neltharion and the brown male whom he and Kalik had noted at Telenix's gathering, but also Alexstrasza and Ysera. The sisters hovered at opposite ends of the area where the males finished their macabre adversaries, the females keeping wary watch for more threats. Neltharion was in the process of tearing to shreds the creature he fought. Of the Brown's foe, there was no sign, which could only mean that the newcomer had readily dispatched the undead. As Malagos neared, Neltharion let the last fragments of his opponent fall away. Of the group, only the charcoal gray male looked cheerful. "Ha! We have won!" "We can still lose," the Brown reminded him with a hint of impatience. "Many more not living near." Alexstrasza and Ysera joined the trio. "We see nothing," the yellowish female muttered. "Nothing but death." Her sister hissed at her, but Ysera looked undaunted. Through Malagos, Kalik learned that Ysera was of the belief that there was still a way to achieve peace with Galakron. She was not the only one, either. Malagos eyed the brown male. "I know you." The other dipped his head. "Nosdormu. Fight well." Neltharion chuckled. "Fights almost as well as me." Yeah, we knew it was him. Nosdormu's smile was very brief. "Many not living. Why here? Why now?" It became apparent to both Kalik and his host that none of the rest had witnessed anything akin to what Malagos had experienced earlier. Nor had anyone evidently seen Koros seemingly flying after Galakron. For the moment, Malagos chose not to mention the latter incident, the ghastly sight he had seen before that obviously of much more importance. As clever as he was, Malagos was still a proto-dragon. The words he needed to explain properly what he had seen Galakron do with his victims were hard to put together, especially with danger still close at hand. So bound to Malygos was he that Kalik not only felt the proto-dragon's frustration, but also wished that he could speak for him. Through halting words, Malygos did his best. His descriptions were short, but raw emotion filled in many gaps, enhancing his tale. He left the other proto-dragons shocked, even Neltharion. No one disbelieved him, all understanding that Malygos was to be trusted. "How?" Alexstrasza demanded with much consternation. "How? What has happened with Galakrond?" Malygos thought he understood. "Galakrond must eat much. Galakrond could not find enough. He grew hungry. Too hungry. Ate one of us." Although to Kalik such an act might have once seemed not so shocking, these were proto-dragons, creatures he had thought simply brutes. He saw that they had boundaries much like those of dragons. The proto-dragons might fight to the death against one another, but they did not eat their foes. No matter their savagery, this concept revolted them. Even though they had witnessed Galakrond committing the heinous act on a grand scale, they still did not want to accept it. "Was hungry," Neltharion snarled, his generally cheerful demeanor at last broken by what they were discussing. "Ate one of us. Why eat more? Grazers came north, more food. You saw Galakrond eat. Enough food now. Why still do this?" Malygos shook his head. No one else had an answer either. There came more hisses. The proto-dragons glanced toward the sounds. The hisses were still far away, but seemed to be getting nearer. "We leave," Alexstrasza decided. "Now." There was no protest, not even from Neltharion. They had no idea how many of the unliving might attack next. Malygos' discovery of how the unliving came to be had altered everything. Malygos instinctively took point. Kalik's world turned upside down, and despite trying to prepare himself for it this time, the dragon blacked out. As ever, the darkness passed swiftly, although in this case only a brief passage of time, not a return to reality, occurred. The proto-dragons were on the attack, Talanixa leading the charge. Scores of proto-dragons representing nearly all the families with which Kalik's host was familiar dived into the fray. Their enemy was not Galakrond, however, but several undead. Where Malygos and his companions had had a disadvantage in numbers, the opposite was now true. The proto-dragons faced perhaps a dozen of the animated corpses, which Kalik immediately understood had been purposely drawn to the deep canyon in which this battle played out. Through Malygos, Kalik caught a glimpse of Ysera and also knew that Alexstrasza and Neltharion were part of the effort. Nosdormu had refused to be a part of it, although not out of any cowardice. Malygos did not know where he was, and at the moment had no time to care. Outnumbered the horrors might be, but they still dealt death. The first to learn that terrible fact was an impetuous fire-orange female appearing some seasons older than Alexstrasza. One of the initial attackers, she fell upon a smaller undead, once a proto-dragon just out of its juvenile years. However, although the prey looked easy, and Malygos had been among those offering warning about the dangers of their enemy, she left herself open to the undead's breath. The dark, noxious cloud draped over the female's head and wings. She shrugged it off, then opened her mouth to unleash her own blast. But suddenly the brilliant color of her scales faded wherever the cloud had touched. The flesh withered, and skin flaked away. Instead of exhaling a mighty blast at the fiend, the female let out a rasping cry as her eyes glazed over. And as Malygos and Kalik watched, briefly mesmerized, the scale and flesh fell away into the blink of an eye. The exposed skull, the jaws still open, cracked off and dropped out of sight. The torso, the ruined wings feebly flapping, followed. Above, Talanixa roared in anger at the proto-dragon's fatal error. Leading another of her family, she dropped upon the small undead and ripped it apart through the back. For good measure, the imposing female bit off the head and spat it toward one of the other flying corpses. "Kill like that! No more fools!" Oops, sorry. Her advice, based in part on information Malygos and Neltharion had relayed prior to this assault, served the rest well. Acting in teams of as many as 5, the proto-dragons tore into the remaining not living. One corpse was torn apart in short order, another burned to a crisp. There were still fatalities despite Talanix's insistence, fatalities that Malygos had expected and believed could have been avoided. Emaciated they might be, but the undead nonetheless had surprising physical strength and an unnatural tenacity. Moreover, they did not have to inhale prior to unleashing their horrific clouds of decay. That dire fact was discovered by 2 proto-dragons who assumed that they were safe after avoiding the initial blasts. Their still twitching, decomposing bodies spiraled to the distant ground below. Yet another attacker might have suffered the same ghastly fate if not for Neltharion dropping down on the undead just as it was about to unleash a blast. The future Deathwing seized the corpse's head with both hindpaws and ripped it clean off. A small gush of the deadly gas poured forth from the open neck but touched no one. The charcoal-gray proto-dragon roared with laughter as he tossed away the head and began to rip into the torso, which continued to fly in a haphazard circle. Malygos shook his head at his friend's enthusiasm. For Kalak's host, the sooner this ended, the better. He had no love for what they were doing. Like Alexstrasza and Ysera, Malygos still saw the living in the faces of these abominations. These were victims too. They had to be destroyed, but there was little reason to take joy in the effort. Talonyxis struck the last blow, exhaling hard at a lone undead. The bolt of lightning she unleashed set the dry flesh ablaze. The animated corpse managed to stay aloft, but a second bolt shattered the already crumbling body, sending ashes scattering everywhere. With the destruction of her foe, the huge golden female roared triumphantly. Her cry was taken up by many of the others, causing Malygos to wince as he thought of how loud they were. It had been in part their cries that were used in the first place to help lure these not living to them. Malygos marveled that Talonyxa and her supporters did not think this through, but he knew better than to try to speak the truth. Talonyxa did not abide those who did not agree with her, and had already scarred a copper male in the face for questioning her. She also had several zealous followers willing to do worse to any other naysayers. For now, the sisters, Neltharion, and Kalak's host were going along with Talonyx's decisions while they argued over what better choice to make. What that choice might be, none of them had as yet been able to suggest, and all knew that time was quickly running out. Kalak could also see the disaster looming and did not think this brief triumph foreshadowed the same against Galakron any more than Malygos did. Kalak silently railed at his own defenselessness in the matter, and at that moment he realized that he felt more attuned to these ancient events than to his own troubles in the present. This is not right, Kalak thought. This is a reflection of the past. It's done. The future is the only battle left to be fought. But still, Kalak felt as much a part of this small band of proto-dragons as Malygos was. When Alexstrasza and Ysera spoke to his host, it was as if they spoke to Kalak. Even more surprising, when Neltharion stood at Malygos' side, fighting along with him as any true friend and comrade would, Kalak experienced the same kinship Malygos had developed with the charcoal-gray male. Kinship with Deathwing. And through a host who would someday become almost as much of a threat to Azeroth. The notion shook Kalak, and he railed anew at what had happened to him, hoping that somehow he could return to his own time and body. Young Malygos, ever ignorant of Kalak's plight, was more concerned with his friend. He noted Ysera rapidly descending into the canyon, her flight path somewhat erratic. Seeing no sign of Alexstrasza, Malygos chose to follow the yellowish female himself. With what was obvious effort, Ysera alighted just a few yards above the bottom. The scorched, torn remnants of undead lay scattered below her. As Malygos dropped near her, he saw that Ysera's breathing had become labored. Within Malygos, Kalak, his own distress momentarily forgotten, shared his host's concern for the other proto-dragon. Ysera did not notice Malygos until he was almost upon her. Even then, she only looked up at him with sullen eyes, then continued her efforts to regain her breath. The icy male landed beside her, but did not speak. Observing Ysera, Malygos noted her gaze drifting from one ripped piece of dry flesh to another. Neither Malygos nor Kalak could make sense of her observations. The fragments were from a variety of families, including both Malygos's and Neltharion's, but not upon closer inspection, Ysera's. Not here, she finally murmured as her breathing calmed. Not here. After a moment, Malygos asked, Who? Dralad. The name meant nothing to either Kalak or his host. Malygos waited, and both were rewarded a few breaths later as Ysera clarified. Clutch, brother. Malygos hissed low, then muttered, He is dead. These were, too. That had occurred to both Malygos and Kalak, but not what Ysera was implying. So body, Malygos offered. Then she looked up at the male, her gaze steady and demanding. Not burned by my sister. You destroy it. Malygos shook his head. There had been no thought of destroying the dead at that point. Even though this generation had seen proto-dragons leap to a level of intelligence far in advance of anything they had developed before, the notion of a proper burial was not something the creatures had yet conceived. Even dragons, Kalak knew, simply preferred to come to their final rest near the temple, and oddly near Galakron. Watched every not living, Ysera went on, stretching her wings. She looked recovered from her bout, although she was clearly still somewhat weary. Not found. Not found. His body. Not there, the female snapped. Then, looking more tired again, she shrugged off their conversation and took to the air. Kalak's host watched as she ascended. What he recalled of that discovery had made him believe that Ysera's clutch brother had not risen as so many others had. Other early victims remained dead. Alexstrasza had no doubt that said something to that effect to her sister, but Ysera's own search and its lack of success bothered Malygos and Kalak. Was it possible that the older dead were also rising? If so, then the threat to the living proto-dragons was far worse than they had imagined. Malygos shook his head, far too many thoughts assailing him. He was still a proto-dragon, no matter how clever he had always regarded himself to be. That he believed Alexstrasza would have been just as pressed by all these concerns did not make Malygos feel any better. Kalak, with so much going on in the present but now trapped in this vision of the past, could again easily sympathize. A low, barely audible hiss from the southern end of the canyon drew Malygos' attention. It was so short that neither the proto-dragon nor Kalak was certain that he had heard it, and yet Kalak at least knew that both had. Keeping low, Malygos cautiously crawled south. His eyes darted to every shadow, observing every large shape, be it the remains of an animated corpse or what simply proved to be a rock. He listened carefully for a repeat of the hiss, but heard only the wind coursing through the canyon, a sound both knew was not the same one heard earlier. Possible answers ran through the proto-dragon's mind as he moved. A not living that had managed to hide from the hunters? These corpses did not hide. They only knew their relentless hunger and thus ever searched for prey. They did not run away from it. Another potential source for the sound was an injured member among the attackers. This made more sense, but why had no one noticed the wounded fighter missing? Kalak watched with Malygos, but saw nothing. He questioned the wisdom of the proto-dragon's determination to find the noise, but there was no stopping Malygos. Shadows filled the area ahead. Malygos paused, then plunged into the darkness. His eyes began to adjust to the change in lighting. Something touched Malygos on the back. The proto-dragon's head twisted around. Both he and Kalak caught sight of a smaller, flowing figure. Malygos hissed as his head suddenly pounded. For Kalak, though, it was as if all the thunder that had ever raged over Azeroth gathered for one fantastic storm. Had he paws of his own, Kalak would have clamped them against his ears. As it was, he could only roar as the pounding rose beyond bearing. And for once, Kalak was grateful when darkness finally claimed him. Alright, so I don't know who this hooded figure is. It could be a dragon in that kind of form, like a humanoid form. Could be a wizard, a mage. My guess is it's some time traveler. But it also could be something bigger than that. It might be one of the Titans, because the Titans, like an avatar of the Titans, that's how they become aspects. So those people have to be on Azeroth. Alright, cool. We got another episode in the pipe, 5x5. We got some things, some food for thought for the next episode. And I look forward to seeing you guys next time on Lore of Warcraft.